Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. I don't know the lyrics to this song. Sandman has officially been out for a weekish on Netflix, and I have so many thoughts on how this was a success in many ways and dropped the ball in several others. But for the first half of this review, I'm going to keep it spoiler-free before getting into a spoiler-filled discussion with Kayla in the second half. For those of you who still want the narrative to remain spoiler-free for them, here are my overall thoughts on what Sandman accomplished and failed to accomplish. I would of course like to start with some of the positives, and want to kick that off by just complimenting the visuals and some of the smaller stories told within this season. There was emotionally impactful beats continually from beginning all the way to the end in terms of side characters or little short stories woven in that were just always thematically resonant and didn't feel time wasting, even though in the grand scheme of the season they weren't entirely tied into the grander narrative, or they were only loosely tied into the grander narrative. I also think while it did vary wildly in quality, when the editing and visuals of this show were at their peak, they really hit in a way that felt like a total success in terms of adapting Sandman. Some of the ways we traversed into the real world, the characters that were supposed to feel otherworldly, when they were done best, were absolute successes. And in terms of antagonists, while I have issue with the structure of the presentation of the two biggest antagonists of the season, the writing and performance behind them elevated them to being so memorable. We first have Lupin from Harry Potter, who was coming across at first kind of sympathetic, but as things went on, I personally was just terrified. And then there's the Corinthian, which almost goes in a bit of an inverse direction, where I'm never sympathetic towards him, but I at least understand the motivations from where he's coming well enough to be like, oh, that's a nuanced villain who is interesting to see go against Dream. This is where I'm going to transition into talking about a bit of my issues with the show, and a lot of the smaller problems I'm going to get into stem from the fact that this feels like two seasons of television squished down into one. There is a transition point, I believe in episode 6 or 7, where the narrative kind of wraps up and we start what feels like a new story. There are tangential things that cross over through this point, but once we cross that line, I as a viewer was suddenly asked by the narrative to care about a very large cast of new characters, from Rose into just a parade of people she comes across, and the show didn't have time to get me to care about them enough, which is a shame because there are really interesting ideas put into this section of the season, but for me overall it did take a step down just because, again, there wasn't enough time to flesh out what needed to be done, and to get where the show needed to go, a lot of crutches were brought into the writing that made the overall experience of the story feel quite a bit weaker for me. This comes down to a lot of exposition dump type scenes, characters not reacting nearly big enough to some of the things that are happening to them, resulting in them just either accepting wild information that should be putting them in shock, but instead they just seem fine, and continual stupid decisions in terms of staying in danger just so that the plot can get where it needs to go. There is a scene where, I'm not going to get into specific spoilers, people witness direct murder, and they are aware of the fact that a lot of people around them are very evil and they know danger could be upon them at any minute. They are left alone with no one watching them, and they choose to stay there and go to sleep. And you can say like they were magic to sleep, but we do know they were left alone for a large chunk of time before crawling into bed. And there's this tonal shift past this line too, where Sandman goes from feeling like a very heavy epic that you're meeting intense, gargantuan characters who are acted pretty well across the board, into what feels like a much more smaller CW type drama, but is done a lot better than a lot of those CW shows ever would. But even the way it's shot is suddenly far less interesting, and we get a lot less of those visually interesting beats from the first half of the show. I swear it feels like two different showrunners made this season. All of those complaints being said, I still really liked a lot of the acting that was given to us in this second half, especially the youngest child performer, Jed, who did just such a good job with what he was handed. There is also an abuse narrative that on its own is tense enough, and I care enough to really carry me through up into the point where the show does manage to kind of get back up on its feet and maintain enough interest for me to continue for the end. But without that line, There's a solid 2 episodes here where I was just like, why am I supposed to care? And then the final negative, as I said, there are really amazing visuals in this show and fantastic VFX, but there are also some really bad ones, and unfortunately one of the last big shots of the season that's supposed to be the big tease for the next season is probably the weakest VFX we get for the whole season, as this small rift opens in hell. I won't get any more specific that for spoilers, but what you're looking at, I could make that in like an afternoon with some software on my laptop. Like, it was not acceptable to be in this show. But I would like to end by talking about some more positives, and that is actually going to be, of course, talking about Dream. I haven't read enough of Sandman to speak in depth about the story and the adaptation of it. I've just picked up some of the comics, and I've actually skipped ahead and read some things. It's been a bit of spoiling for myself. But the character of Dream themselves, well, I do not feel like they are the character from the comics very well. It's a confident interpretation that added enough interest, where by the end of it, I was okay with this interpretation of the character of Dream, despite some inconsistencies with the character as a whole in the weaker episodes. And man, when this show stands on its feet, we have some magnificent little set pieces that are executed that I loved. But there is specifically an episode that focuses on a diner and a bit of hell being unleashed on some people. And from the beginning to the very end of it, I was hooked. It leads to a confrontation with a specific antagonist that I wasn't the biggest fan of. In fact, I think both of the big antagonist showdowns, in terms of what's resolved in season 1, were a bit anticlimactic, and I wanted more from them. And again, I think this is largely due to the fact that this should have been 2 separate seasons to give both of these antagonists more time to have an appropriately large showdown. Also led to some inconsistencies of the character of Dream. There's even points where, like, someone calls him stupid to his face, and I had to agree, like, yeah, he's being really stupid right now. And especially the season resolution, where you have the cliche of characters running in last moment with information and big reveals that just didn't feel earned and were written in a way that felt sloppy to me personally. I was left with a sour taste for the season as a whole, but that doesn't entirely erase the positives. And with episodes like the Diner one or the one with Constantine, absolutely think this show is worth watching. And there's also an episode with Dream and Death that at first I was kind of not sure on, but by the end of it, I was super charmed and loved it. It was so enjoyable once you got to the end. So yes, Sandman is absolutely a successful adaptation of Sandman with problems, but none of those problems I think can't be overcome in a season 2, and I think what we as the viewers got was an enjoyable interpretation of Sandman. And I really hope they sure up a more consistent version of Dream's character in season 2, because like watching him going from like confronting gods to like demurely apologizing is strange. And holy crap, please blend Patton Oswalt's audio better. But I wasn't offended by this, and I had a good time. So for overall, it's going to be a pretty light 7 out of 10 for me. At its best, it does feel like a great Sandman adaptation with weighty ideas behind it that are thoroughly thought out. And at its worst, it feels like a really good YA adaptation. But now, let us go ahead and transition into a spoiler-filled discussion with Kayla. I put it in my mouth. I fit that in my mouth once.
I can't. Oh, my jaw just popped.
We did just get a thumbnail, though. So we watched Sandman together, and we watch a lot of shows together.
I don't want to say controversial, but it definitely, after each episode, we would have a pause and we'd be like, all right, we got to talk about this for a second.
It was equal praise and criticism.
Yeah.
Especially early on, we really dug it.
Oh, yeah.
And then we started really not. And then by the end, I was like, eh.
There were different tones or different stories or different beats where I was just like, oh, this is a really great way to interpret that or a great way to set this up. And then there would be this hard shift, which I know you've mentioned about tonal dissonance here, where it would feel like something else completely. And it's not that that's bad. It's just it felt like I was watching 3 different stories. Is this an epic fantasy? Is this a CW supernatural ripoff? Is this a gritty horror kind of going on Stranger Things type thing? You know, like it just felt like there was no overarching kind of connection between them.
I will agree for the second half, but let's talk about this like it's 2 different shows.
Yeah,
because like to be honest, it really is in a lot of the ways, especially for the structure. I don't know, I'm so far away from you.
Come by me.
So the first show, when he's stuck in the orb, the ramifications from that, the gym, I think that was honestly like one of my, if it had ended after episode 6, I've been like, this is one of my favorite shows of the year so far.
Going off of that, I felt, and I know a lot of critics kind of disagreed, that the first half actually did a really great job. I got connected to the family that was involved. Yep. I got connected to Dream. Okay, Ruby, Sand, Helm, Dream God, Nightmare, family, Raven. We've got all these things that we can follow and be connected to, which then leads off naturally to like Lucifer, Desire.
And going off that, all the exposition around those things, well, it could get pretty exposition-y, felt much more natural than what we got in the second half of the show, especially with the artifacts of like the gem and the helmet and the sand. It was never like just overtly explained to you. You just picked up what it was from context.
Yeah.
The reason I had a big reaction to you saying like, we connected to Dream, that goes to the performance of the actor, because he has basically no actual lines of dialogue. We get his internals a lot, but his expressions, his observing of those around him, that was when I was like, oh, this is a great adaptation of Dream from the comics. And then when some things happened later on, I was like, I can't really speak because I haven't read all of it, but it feels wrong.
Overall, the first half felt like you are introduced to characters. You connect to these characters and their struggles and why they're doing the things they're doing. Then, once that is resolved and Dream becomes this person, now we're introduced to more backstory about his family. We meet Death, we meet Desire, we get more about that, but it all relates and makes sense. And then this random tonal shift. Like, I remember specifically saying to you when the Corinthian is driving away in his little car, they do this like flip it and pan down to watch him drive off into the sunset. I'm like, I've seen this scene in Supernatural 30,000 times. This is Jensen Ackles driving away. And then to The Boys, where he apparently went next. And I was just like, that was weird. And then literally 2 episodes later, we see him at a cereal convention, which is witty and cool in a great way, but I felt like this was an episode of Supernatural again.
And if you're going to do these 2 stories, I would have flipped them because the stakes are inherently lower in the second one. And so you're going from like, okay, he's fighting Lucifer to he's at a serial killer convention. I get a serial convention scary for a human, but we've established Dream will fight Lucifer. That's not, like, now he's in the serial killer convention, and by the way, the serial killer convention gets handled, he just, like, gives them all consciousness and makes them realize, which was a cool beat. I actually, like, seeing them all start killing themselves and stuff, I was like, that's a creative punishment. I did dig that. But I wanted that to, if you're going to do this premise, give it 3 more episodes.
So, like, in terms of acting, Corinthian did great. Lucifer did great.
I really liked Lucifer's performance. And her second in command, who was that?
Mazikeen.
Mazikeen. Yeah. I kept wanting to call her Marzipan.
We've been watching a lot of Great British Bake Off.
So in the first half, I really want to talk about Lupin.
Oh, yeah, Remus Lupin. David Thewlis, I think his name is.
He did an absolutely insanely good job. And the diner episode might be my favorite episode of television this year so far. It was so creepy. We were just like, that was the one episode we didn't pause. We didn't pause at all. We were just glued to it. And it is a bunch of different takes. Obviously, there's cuts, but the way it's shot makes it feel like you're just watching everything happen in real time. And then once the nightmare shroud comes down and like the full evil of what's going on is unveiled and the philosophy of the difference between the lie and the dream, that was fascinating. I loved how the show interpreted dreaming versus lies versus human interaction with each other. It actually had so much to say and it was so poignant.
Yeah, it was really well done, but also even before that, the way he interacted with Rosemary, this kindly woman who picks him up.
I totally forgot about that. It was so good.
Oh my God, the tension that I felt in that car, I just was like, the way he would talk and the way that she was interacting, it was so tense. He was captivating in his performance, and that made the people around him also just as captivating. It was well shot, well choreographed, just overall a great seamless way to show he leaves this mental institution. He
drags them into his insanity.
Yeah, and then he reaches his goal, and then he ends up accomplishing it in a smaller setting in the diner, and then he's gone, and I felt, wow, that was such a great captivating thing. I'm looking forward to see what happens next, because if that captivated me, wow.
Yeah, but then it's resolved.
Yeah.
Like, it's just he has a fight with Dream, that Dream wins because of hacks. Look, we can move into the second half now in the serial killer convention.
This is what throws me off. Okay, so when Rose Walker, he mentions either in episode
Great
5
name
or 6.
for a character. I love the name Rose Walker.
Yeah, I didn't know who he was talking about because it was so randomly thrust in there. I thought that she was somehow related to Rosemary, the lady in the car, and he was like, oh, calling her Rose Walker because her name's Rosemary. But then this kid shows up on the screen, and I'm like, who's that? Is that related to Rosemary? Because we were introduced to this lady for an episode who we grew attached to, and then we don't see any ramifications of that episode afterwards, and now we're in this new girl. And I'm like, who are you? I don't care.
Complaint for the characterization of the entire show. This woman discovers she's like 6 to 8 months pregnant, just discovers that, and the biggest reaction she has is like, that's weird. I would be actively shitting myself.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, like, these first 2 episodes where we're introduced to people, I had real issue because I'm sure everyone was directed in a way, but the acting to me felt very staged and like very much hitting beats. And I got to this point where I looked at Daniel and I'm like, I just don't feel invested in these characters and what they're saying. They're talking about these high stakes things that are happening, but I'm just not connected to them or how they're delivering it either.
It also felt like the production was less invested in them because we even started at one point making a joke. We were watching a scene where Rose and Lydia.
It was
weird,
yeah.
and my dyslexic brain couldn't handle it. But they kept talking back and forth, and Kayla and I started going, shot, reverse shot, shot, reverse shot, because it's just all that happened. And it's like we had these really engaging, well-shot, staged, and blocked scenes between people, and then suddenly, like comparing this to the diner, there's just so many scenes back to back where they took no effort to do anything interesting visually, and I kept thinking, this is Sandman! Like, give us some flair here. And that's part of what contributed to it just feeling like CW, where they can't be bothered to do anything more than shot, reverse shot, shot, reverse shot.
Over the shoulder, over the shoulder, over the shoulder, over the shoulder. But then, like, on top of that, it felt like when those episodes hit, Morpheus's character suddenly shifted.
Different character.
He was a different, and I understand they're trying to say, oh, he's falling back. Like they mentioned in the story, that's not how he was before. He was always like this. And I just didn't get that because for 6 episodes, we had this person who had suffered and who was feeling for the people that were being horrifically affected by all these other characters, and then suddenly he's just like this pouty little I'm in charge here,
which is weird because he had just had this episode with Death where the takeaway at the end was like our love for our craft, our love for humanity, and doing our job is our purpose, and it had this really uplifting tone, but then it's trying to like tell us that Dream's takeaway from this was to treat everyone who works for him like they should just worship him like a king and nothing beyond that. And I was like, this is a kind of huge betrayal of that beat where the characters seem to have like an enlightening, but you're taking that enlightening and making him into like a dictator?
If it would have been spread out over a longer period of time, either we would have seen Morpheus falling into bad habits and having more people commenting on it, so that way we get that full rounded arc of him, or just have him for this season still be recovering from 100-some years in a cage and then learning from that experience. This just felt too compressed into one season. And I would say overall, I still enjoyed it. Like, there were definitely a few episodes and a few parts where I'm just like, oh my God. But overall, I thought the concepts are really good and the certain stories and then the setup for the next upcoming season here with what Lucifer is going to do and crossing boundaries and stuff. That's all part of that epic fantasy that I mentioned before. And it's not because I love epic fantasy television, therefore prefer it. It's just that it makes sense to have that all combined.
It is because I love epic fantasy television more, and I'm 100% willing to admit that. So I'm going to end this by asking you a question that I already answered.
Okay.
Would you still watch a season 2?
Absolutely. I love the concepts. I love the ideas behind it. I think overall, I'm actually really interested in the comics, which is new for me because I don't read comics. I really would love to see where the story goes further. And I just hope that given the reaction they've seen now from people and the criticisms, that they'll just take those and apply it and, make a tighter story.
It's not just because Dream's really hot. And that'll be the end of it. Thank you, everyone. Love you. Bye.